I'm going to talk to you about, sensory and embodied methods of engagement. I'm going to sort of speak to two tools that I engage with my students, as well as speaking to how these tools came into play, or just how they developed through what I've discerned through teaching. So as the future becomes more complex and uncertain, students need to be encouraged to develop a creative practice and scholarship or knowledge which is culturally diverse, contextual, experimental and adaptive, while also, I believe, and I think this is super important, finding pleasure in the process of their knowledge creation. The creative process, in fact the birthing of anything, is a pretty fierce and unsettling procedure. Over the last 5 years, I've found that students have greater expectations regarding what they will gain from their education in very measurable terms, and this cannot be separated from the rising costs of tuition fees, whilst they're also laden with a dense weave of personal, social and political responsibilities. As the students endeavour to navigate these responsibilities, they're bombarded with an endless stream of information and visual imagery, a myriad of sources of inspiration, countless perspectives, actionable processes to engage, as well as increasing levels of anxiety and self-doubt. Sumitra Upham states in the essay Rethinking Ecologies of Care that this hyper-mediated culture is breeding new forms of loneliness, anxiety and inequality in contemporary society. And somehow amidst all of this, when complexity and overwhelm are abound, our students are required to make affirming proposals, to identify and to define. So I'm going to introduce two particular tools or methods I engage to encourage students to embrace multiplicity while also navigating the unknown. And this comes through fostering dialogues around sense-making and tacit knowledge, not only with regard to design as a concept, but as a process of development. I believe it is impossible to educate students in fashion and clothing design without embracing physicality and foregrounding emotional energy and sense pleasure. How to manage, navigate, and eventually calm the commotion of the thinking head becomes possible through movement. The active process of making and doing becomes the entry point in the same way that clothing is an entry point that allows us to enter into the experience of wearing them. The transition to temper the thinking head towards pleasure or flow is not without discomfort, but the progression can shift fluidly, although not always seamlessly, when the body becomes the conduit that calms. As a form of somatic practice, we feel our way as we decipher, negotiate, focus and define. Touching, feeling, intuiting and thinking all merge in a sensing or embodied knowledge. Bell Hooks practices an engaged pedagogy as a liberatory practice of freedom and emphasizes well-being, which connects the will to know with the will to become. Anchoring or grounding processes in and through the physical body, the emotional body, encourages practices which seek to decolonize knowledge systems, beginning with feeling into our interconnected bodies and values. If we consider the relational implications of clothing, that is, how we live in and with clothing, we have the capacity to reauthor the design processes in ways that become more thoughtful, careful, and connected. So, tool 1, language as material. So often I witness an inherent belief within students that language controls them, certainly when it comes to the written word, as opposed to the appreciation that they are using language to communicate almost every minute across a multitude of platforms. Students also slip into ways of communicating with the written word that they would not for a moment engage when speaking or messaging. When words have to be put down on the page, it seems that in a moment all of the aspirations that students embrace as a natural part of the creative process, which involve rupture, reverie, emotion, impulse, beauty, transformation, responsiveness, negotiation, willfulness, subjectivity, and upending existing ways of seeing and doing, somehow become paralyzed when it comes to writing about their process or practice. Inadvertently, the requirement of a written thesis places many students in a position of dread, and their usually expansive mindset becomes constricted as their trepidation immobilizes. Therefore, I always try to work with processes that engage an assortment of bodily or sensing skills as a means to tap into what the student already carries as an instinctive navigational system. I approach writing as a means to bridge thinking and making and cultivate the development of processes whereby language becomes the material and writing a spatial practice that mirrors a quality of movement or physical awareness that already exists within the student's studio practice. And I use this term loosely to incorporate all manner of creating possibilities. The process has become almost a somatic activity with which to conceptualize and or reveal unexpected knowledge. As such, students' personal preconceptions related to writing as being a separate practice distinct from their visual making or creating is overturned, and they cultivate the realization that meaning will be revealed through the very process of writing, as opposed to writing because meaning has been established. The more responsive prompts I've developed emerge as a catalyst for courageous action, and over the years have proven to become consequential for the students, not only in the context of gaining confidence in the communication of their ideas and or concepts, but in the summoning of a fearless vulnerability when confronting the indeterminate possibilities ahead. I invite students to consider the mutable, embodied experiences of clothing with respect to meaning, and focus on questions such as: how do we use clothes to negotiate tenuous, fragile, and elastic self-other, past-present, and present-future relations? Amplifying the dynamic and convoluted engagement between meaning and process, I begin to exercise the tenuous relationship between head and body, with prompts that encourage students to respond to their inner instinct or senses through stream of consciousness writings, done by hand and done over several weeks. Written on waking, that is in a horizontal or less conscious mindset, the 10 to 15 minute free writing is done before the rational thinking head is fully engaged or begins to doubt and self-edit. I also support students writing in any language that allows them to express themselves most fluidly. After a period of 21 days, students reread their writings and copy down or highlight any of the declarations, statements, or revelations that they believe have identified something particular or unexpected about their work. These highlighted writings are then reassembled and formulated into a 1 to 2 page statement about their vision for their work, process, and or research. What students determine is that they know unconsciously far more about themselves, what they want to do as a mission or motivation, than they consciously realize or give themselves credit for. This process also initiates a momentum and willingness to wander and to wonder within. Another prompt that has students approaching the construction of language with enthusiasm and daring, while appreciating that there is no such thing as a singular vision, but rather a perspective made up of a bricolage of experiences and a myriad of references, cultural influences, and sources, involves collaging or sampling together texts, quotes, conversations that they've gathered over a period of time. There are no limitations regarding what is an acceptable text or relevant or appropriate language for them to use as source material. And in this way, the hierarchies with knowledge transfer are removed. That is, whether or not they gather text or information from a scientific journal, a quote from a philosopher, a line from a song, a text exchange, a transcript from a voyage, a recipe, an advertisement for a packet of chips, etc., etc. The students gather whatever resonates for them and whatever holds meaning. Oops, gone one too far ahead. Ideally, when the students write a statement about their process or research without the addition of their own words, as they begin to build and shape the fragments of found language, they tap into a raw and vital aspect of engagement because the found words are not their own. Repeatedly, students end up revealing and defining their concepts and motivations with more conviction and honesty through the process because language is no longer precious. The words are formed or played with as found material and used without restraint. This particular prompt has been so effective that on a number of occasions I've had graduate students using this method to actually write their final thesis. In this collage text here, the coloured lines actually come alive with music as well. So the next tool that I'd like to present is scent and smell. The power of image making and appearance have come to dominate the experience of fashion and clothing. How an image looks and is disseminated is now a key measure of desirability. Fashion and clothing are aesthetic experiences, although I'm not referring to the primary aesthetic interpretation in the world of fashion whereby look becomes a commodity, but rather in relation to the aesthetic experience as described by Adorno's aesthetic theory, wherein the aesthetic is the name for the sensory configuration that enshrines a deeper, less accountable logic of being able to combine ideas, narratives, instances, which could otherwise not be if subjected to logic or ideology. Although the relationship between fashion and fragrance is long-standing and intertwined, I was initially motivated to introduce scent or smell into students' processes of development due to the fact that most were primarily focused on the aesthetic consideration of their concepts with regard to outer appearance, surface and form, in ways that align with Paul Sweetman's analysis of fashion as a system whereby the body in fashion is simply a mannequin or shop window dummy. It is the clothing rather than the wearing of it that is regarded as significant. Secondary to, or even separate from the development of their design output, was the emotional potential of their ideas and how their designs for clothing connected to the feeling or energy of the body or bodies doing the wearing. Having worked with scent in my own practice as a conduit to access emotions and as a design provocation, I invited students to contemplate what their collection might smell like and to focus on the experiential possibilities inherent in their designs. In essence, I wanted them to immerse themselves into the presence of their designs or clothing and to imagine what they might become when they close their eyes. In doing so, although it takes a little practice to not focus on the objective production, students are moved into a space of expansive receptivity and become palpably aware of overlap, interconnectivity, nuance, and complexity. Through feeling into, they come to realize that the designs they wish to create have a pace or a tempo and are relational and affecting. That is, with all of the sensorial pleasures of diverse, multi-layered understandings that extend far beyond productivity and the tweaking of the visual pleasure button. Judith Tahar poses the question, how can you really see a colour if you cannot feel it, and if you cannot translate it into a taste? How can we imagine if we cannot smell the air? Sensorial experiences help to enhance intuition, and it also helps to train very fine receptors. So, for example, and this is simplifying massively what a student might come to the table with, but should they suggest that their collection smells of oil, they're asked to be more explicit and articulate which oil, while defining the attributes of the oil, the associative qualities and evocative potential. This requires responses which have to be felt into first, and become very specific with regard to context, place, and feeling as motivation or embodied experience. Students' responses can divulge vast schisms in the visual manifestation of their work with regard to what they are sensing or imagining on an emotional level. And this disparity opens up opportunities regarding the conceptual or material development of students' ideas and encourages them to discern more tenuous or complex responses. The sense of smell is often described as being the most primal or intimate of senses. It is precognitive, and in a peculiar way, smelling short-circuits conscious thoughts. It bonds to memory and emotion before it subjects itself to concepts and emerges as already part of the bodily unconscious. It is precisely because scent or smell have the capacity to open up our experiential cognition that it becomes the perfect medium to communicate the inherent embodiedness of a garment. Beginning with smell as a process, we deepen the relationship to the corporal, to sensitivities and awareness. Designing from this perspective offers a garment affective potential. It also requires spending time with the inner world and imagining in ways that cultivate patience and awareness. Cecil Tullas states, that when we reclaim our true sense of smell, our senses work together in greater harmony. Subliminal impressions are brought to the surface, emotions become more vibrant, and we develop a greater tolerance for things that once disturbed us. Fashion, clothing, and adornment are multifaceted forms of communication, expressions of identity and identities that are inseparable from how we connect, move through, and act upon the world. As Paul Gadsden states, fashion doesn't limit itself to garments. It expresses itself in our speech, in our movements, in the objects we create, in the way we shape and perform our identities and our relationships. It is a very lively, dynamic, and exciting space. However, the consumption of fashion as a commodity and visual feast oftentimes privileges the objective gaze, and one that is complicit in upholding a Eurocentric, narrow, and exclusionary perspective of style, taste, and beauty. And this is over the embodied, connected, or feeling experience. Yet clothing is about bodies. Clothing engages sensing, and senseful bodies. Bell Hooks writes in Teaching to Transgress that education is a practice at integrating theory and practice, ways of knowing, with habits of being. Engaging the body or bodies as a means to feel into and discern also allows for alternate ways of being and knowledge experience to enter into the space. As a practice, this becomes a challenge to normative modes of evolution and dominant systems of knowledge understanding within the discipline. There have been and continue to be so many biases within academia whereby the objectivity of the aesthetic experience is venerated above sense-orientated knowledge perception and non-Western ways of thinking and being. As educators actively work to foster students as change agents or agents of change, we also need to reconsider what the attributes for such agents might be. As Deborah E. Mayerson offers, that they may not necessarily be those that are characterized by bold vision and strategic savvy, but also those characterized by patience, persistence, and resourcefulness. In this model, change agents are sensitive improvisers who are able to recognize and act on opportunities as they arise. Practices and processes, therefore, which encourage somatic experiences and more embodied and/or internal approaches offer transformative possibilities and truly nourish the promise of a genuinely decolonized fashion education. In the essay Decentralizing Fashion by Renuka Ramanujan, he references the paper The Eurocentric Fashion View Under Interrogation by Sakia Ozodugru, and frames these possibilities beautifully by saying, quite simply, that in order to move into a space where there is more plurality, we have to unlearn our preconceptions of what fashion should be by considering it as a body discipline, which can exist anywhere and in any culture, albeit in different ways. And so with this in feeling, body, mind, and spirit, we should receive the wisdom of the body and senses and sense as process to reimagine and remake the existing systems and methods for fashion and clothing design. Thank you.